The following account was compiled from police reports, hospital records, and a damaged digital recorder found in Millfield County, Pennsylvania. While the events described cannot be verified, the physical evidence suggests something deeply disturbing occurred in the early hours of October 15, 2024. The gravel crunched beneath Marcus Thompson's boots as he stepped out of his pickup truck, the sound unnaturally loud in the suffocating silence of the Pennsylvania wilderness. He'd been driving for 3 hours through increasingly desolate backroads, following GPS coordinates that led him deeper into terrain that seemed forgotten by civilization itself. Marcus was a freelance photographer specializing in abandoned locations, old hospitals, defunct factories, the skeletal remains of America's industrial past. Tonight's destination was a defunct mining camp called Hollowbrook, a place that had been erased from most maps after a cave-in claimed 17 lives in 1962. He'd found references to it buried in online forums, whispered about by urban explorers who claimed the site held something more than historical significance. The beam of his flashlight cut through the October darkness, revealing the rusted skeleton of what had once been a water tower. Beyond it, the shadows suggested the angular shapes of collapsed buildings, their wooden frames jutting from the earth like broken ribs. Marcus shouldered his camera bag and checked his digital recorder, a habit he developed after years of documenting these forgotten places. The red light blinked steadily, capturing the ambient sounds that would later help him remember the atmosphere of each location. What struck him first was the silence. Not the comfortable quiet of a remote location, but an oppressive absence of sound that seemed to press against his eardrums. No insects buzzed in the undergrowth, no wind rustled through the bare October trees, no distant highway hum carried across the miles. It was as if the very air had been drained of life. He began walking toward the ruins, his flashlight beam dancing across the remnants of civilization. A child's tricycle, rusted beyond recognition, lay half-buried beside what might have been a foundation. The sight sent an unexpected chill down his spine. Families had lived here once, children had played in these now empty spaces. The first photograph captured the water tower silhouetted against the star-filled sky. The second documented a collapsed mining shack, its roof beams forming a gaping mouth in the darkness. As he worked, Marcus found himself glancing frequently over his shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching from the treeline. It was while framing his third shot that he heard it, a sound so faint he initially dismissed it as his imagination. A soft scratching like fingernails dragging across wood. He lowered his camera and listened, holding his breath. The sound came again, more distinct now. Screech, screech, screech. Rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind the collapsed buildings. Marcus had explored dozens of abandoned sites, and strange sounds were common. Settling debris, small animals, the wind finding unexpected pathways through broken structures. But this sound carried an intentionality that made his skin crawl. It moved in patterns, starting and stopping, as if something was deliberately making noise. He followed the sound deeper into the ruins, his flashlight beam revealing increasingly disturbing details. Scratch marks scored the wooden surfaces, not random gouges from weather or animals, but parallel lines carved with surgical precision. The marks were everywhere, on door frames, support beams, even carved into the bark of nearby trees. The scratching stopped. Marcus froze, his light fixed on a section of gouged wood. In the sudden silence, he became acutely aware of his own breathing, his heartbeat, the small sounds of his clothing rustling with each movement. He waited, counting seconds that stretched like hours. Then he heard something that made his blood turn to ice water, the sound of his own voice. The beam of his flashlight cut through the October darkness. Came his own words, spoken in his own voice, drifting from somewhere in the ruins ahead. But the voice was wrong. Flat, emotionless, like a recording played through damaged speakers. Marcus's hand trembled as he checked his digital recorder. Still running, red light blinking normally. But the voice continued, repeating phrases he'd spoken into the device during his drive. GPS coordinates, deeper into terrain, forgotten by civilization. The words echoed from multiple directions now, as if several radios were playing his recordings simultaneously. But underneath the familiar phrases, he began to hear other sounds. Clicking, wet breathing, and something that might have been giggling. He turned to retreat to his truck, but the layout of the ruins had somehow changed. The path he'd followed in now led to a solid wall of collapsed timber. The water tower, which should have been visible as a landmark, was nowhere to be seen. His flashlight beam revealed only identical passages between crumbling structures, each one leading deeper into the maze-like remains. The recordings of his voice grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of his own words spoken in dozens of different tones and speeds. Some were high-pitched and childlike, others deep and guttural, all wearing his voice like an ill-fitting mask. That's when he saw the first hint of movement, a pale flash at the edge of his vision, gone the moment he turned toward it. Then another and another fleeting glimpses of something that moved wrong, that seemed to flow rather than walk, that left no sound despite its apparent speed. Marcus raised his camera and fired off several shots in rapid succession, the flash briefly illuminating the ruins in stark detail. In the split second of each exposure, he caught fragments. A thin limb disappearing behind a wall, what might have been a face peering from a doorway, shadows that bent in impossible directions. The digital display on his camera showed the images, but they were wrong. In each photograph, pale shapes filled the frame, dozens of them, surrounding him on all sides, their forms barely distinguishable from the shadows but unmistakably present. And in every image, dark hollows that might have been eyes seemed to stare directly into the camera lens. The recorded voice fragments suddenly ceased, leaving a silence so complete it felt like being underwater. Marcus could hear his own pulse hammering in his ears, the small wheeze of his breath through constricted airways. Then came a new sound, breathing that wasn't his own. It was close, directly behind him, the slow, deliberate inhalation and exhalation of something that shouldn't be there. The breath was cold against the back of his neck, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. Marcus turned slowly, his flashlight beam sweeping across empty air. But the breathing continued, now coming from his left, then his right, then from above, as if something was circling him just beyond the reach of his light. The darkness between the ruins began to shift and coalesce, and Marcus realized with growing horror that what he'd taken for shadows were actually forms. Tall, impossibly thin shapes that had been perfectly still until this moment. Now they were moving, unfolding from the darkness like paper cutouts coming to life. One of them stepped into his flashlight beam. Marcus's scream caught in his throat as he beheld something that violated every assumption about the natural world. The creature stood nearly 7 feet tall but couldn't have weighed more than a child. Its body was a collection of pale, elongated limbs that seemed to bend in too many places. Its skin was the color of old bone, stretched taut over a frame that suggested starvation taken to supernatural extremes. But it was the face that shattered Marcus's ability to think rationally. Where features should have been, there were only deep, black hollows that seemed to absorb his flashlight beam. The creature had no nose, no mouth in any conventional sense. Just smooth, waxy skin interrupted by those terrible, empty sockets that watched him with an intelligence that felt ancient and alien. The thing's arms hung at its sides, but they were wrong too long, ending in hands that possessed far too many joints. Each finger tapered to a point that wasn't quite a claw but suggested the same predatory purpose. As Marcus watched in paralyzed terror, the creature flexed those hands, and he heard the scratching sound again, fingertips scraping against each other in a sound like breaking glass. Behind the first creature, others were emerging from concealment. They moved with a fluid grace that suggested they weren't bound by normal physical laws, flowing between the ruins like water seeking its level. Their collective breathing created a rhythm, in and out, like a tide of predators savoring the moment before feeding. Marcus tried to run, but his legs had forgotten how to function. He managed a stumbling step backward, and the movement seemed to trigger something in the creatures. They tilted their heads in unison, those hollow eye sockets tracking his motion with the precision of hunting animals. The nearest one opened what Marcus now realized was a mouth, a horizontal slash that split its face from ear to ear, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth and a darkness so complete it seemed to extend beyond the creature's physical form. When it spoke, it used Marcus's own voice, perfectly mimicked down to his slight Midwestern accent. The sight held something more than historical significance. The other creatures joined in, creating a chorus of Marcus's voice speaking fragments of his earlier words. Forgotten by civilization, abandoned locations. Something deeply disturbing. As they spoke, the creatures began to advance. They moved in perfect coordination, flowing forward like a tide of pale death. Marcus found his voice finally, releasing a scream that echoed through the ruins and seemed to excite the creatures further. His flashlight beam swayed wildly as he turned to flee, illuminating glimpses of his pursuers, elongated limbs reaching for him, those terrible hollow eyes reflecting nothing, mouths opening wider than should be anatomically possible. The last clear thought Marcus had before the creatures overtook him was that they weren't trying to catch him quickly. They were hurting him, driving him deeper into the ruins, savoring his fear like a fine wine. The digital recorder continued running, capturing the sounds that followed. Marcus's increasingly desperate breathing, the wet scraping of many claws against stone and wood, and underneath it all, a sound like breaking bones and tearing fabric. Then silence. Marcus Thompson was reported missing on October 16, 2024, when he failed to return from a photography expedition. His truck was found on a Forest Service road in Millfield County, with his equipment bag on the passenger seat and his digital recorder on the dashboard. The recorder contained 3 hours of ambient sound, including Mr. Thompson's voice documenting his arrival at what he called Hollowbrook, a location that does not appear on any official maps. The final 37 minutes of the recording consist primarily of screaming and unidentifiable sounds that audio analysts have described as deeply disturbing and unlike anything in our experience. Search teams found no trace of Mr. Thompson or the ruins he described. The GPS coordinates recovered from his phone lead to an empty field with no evidence of previous human habitation. However, investigators did discover something that defied explanation. Scratch marks carved into trees throughout a 2-mile radius around the truck's location. The marks were uniform in depth and spacing, as if made by something with multiple claws of identical length. The case remains open, though active investigation was suspended after 3 search team members reported similar encounters with pale figures in the treeline, and 2 additional personnel went missing during night operations. Local residents have since reported an increase in unusual sounds coming from the forest, scratching, breathing, and voices that seem to mimic their own words back to them from the darkness. The Millfield County Sheriff's Department now advises against any nighttime activities in the area. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some photographs should never be taken. And some places are hungry. The Hollowbrook site, whether real or imagined, serves as a reminder that there are still dark corners of our world where ancient things wait patiently for curious humans to stumble into their domain. They're still waiting, still scratching, still hungry, and they remember Marcus Thompson's voice perfectly.